Finally tonight, remembering actor Paul Reubens, who created the whimsical, beloved character Pee Wee Herman. Here's Kana Whitworth.
For decades, Pee Wee Herman brought joy to millions around the world. But while this happened, the man behind the character, Paul Reubens, faced battles that very few knew about. Pee Wee suddenly faded from the spotlight with a dramatic fall from grace that left fans with so many questions. And for 6 long years, he carried an extremely heartbreaking and painful secret that the world only began to understand after his death. What led to the death of one of the world's most colorful characters? And why did he try to hide what was really going on for so long? Paul Reubens finally opened up about everything in his final message to the world before his death, and the details are extremely heartbreaking. Early life journey to fame. Before Pee Wee Herman made millions of people around the world fall in love with the red bow tie, the too small gray suit, and the quirky laugh, he was just a boy named Paul, who didn't know he'd one day create one of the most iconic characters in television history. Paul Reubens was born Paul Rubenfeld on August 27, 1952, in Peekskill, New York, to parents Judy and Milton Rubenfeld. His mother was a teacher, and his father had a very remarkable background. Not only was he one of the founding pilots of the Israeli Air Force, but he had also flown for the United States Army Air Forces during World War II. That sense of strength and courage must have influenced young Paul, but his path wasn't war or politics. It was something far more colorful. When Paul was just a few years old, his family relocated to Sarasota, Florida, and that move changed everything for him. Sarasota wasn't just a sunny town, it was the winter headquarters for the popular Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus. For any kid, that would have been exciting, but for Paul, it was magic. He was immediately captivated by the spectacle of the circus. The costumes, the physical comedy, and the grand gestures left a deep impression on him. It wasn't just about watching performances, it was about understanding how joy was created. He later said that seeing those clowns perform planted the first seed in his mind on how performance wasn't just entertainment, it was an art. By the time he was a teenager, Paul was already performing in local plays and talent shows. While other kids were thinking about baseball or part-time jobs, Paul was studying timing, body language, and the rhythm of laughter. He had an eye for detail and a love for the absurd, and these eventually became traits that would define his most famous creation. After high school, Paul set his sights on a bigger stage. He briefly attended Boston University, but his true calling took him west, to the California Institute of the Arts, a hotbed of creativity in Valencia, California, founded by Walt Disney himself. At CalArts, he fine-tuned his passion and immersed himself in experimental theater, film design, and storytelling. And then, in the late 1970s, everything shifted when Paul joined the Groundlings, a now legendary improv and sketch comedy troupe in Los Angeles. This wasn't just some local gig. The Groundlings was a launchpad for some of the biggest names in comedy, including Phil Hartman, Will Ferrell, Kristen Wiig, and so many others. And it was there that Paul Reubens birthed the character Pee Wee Herman. But this character didn't just arrive overnight. Paul actually worked tirelessly to shape the character. Yes, Pee Wee was strange, with a cartoonish voice, a childlike sense of wonder, and a chaotic energy, but he was also meticulously crafted. Paul tested gestures, fine-tuned his laugh, played with costume designs, and leaned into a kind of timeless vintage art that would soon become his signature. The Pee Wee Herman character was first introduced as part of a Groundlings sketch, but it quickly took on a life of its own. Audiences couldn't get enough. There was something unexplainably magnetic about this oddball man-child. He was funny, unpredictable, and deeply original, and unlike anything else in comedy at the time. In 1981, Reubens took a bold step and created The Pee Wee Herman Show, a live stage performance that mocked children's TV shows complete with talking furniture, dancing food, and goofy puppets. But beneath the silliness was a sharp wit. The show ran for 5 sold-out months in Los Angeles and was so successful that HBO picked it up and aired it as a special. Suddenly, Pee Wee Herman was no longer a local hit. He was a national phenomenon. But Paul wasn't done yet. In 1985, he teamed up with a then-unknown director named Tim Burton to create Pee Wee's Big Adventure. It was the perfect pairing. Burton brought his offbeat, surrealist eye, while Reubens infused the film with Pee-wee's chaotic joy. And the result was a quirky, hilarious, and surprisingly heartfelt movie that became an instant cult classic. With a modest budget of just $7 million, the film grossed over $40 million at the box office, proving that Pee-wee Herman wasn't just a character, he was a pop culture force. And then came what many consider the crown jewel of Reubens' career, Pee-wee's Playhouse. Premiering on CBS in 1986, the Saturday morning children's show was unlike anything else on TV. It combined live-action performances, claymation, puppetry, and surreal humor in a dazzling high-energy format. The show didn't talk down to kids. Instead, it celebrated imagination, diversity, and curiosity with style. Critics loved it, parents trusted it, and the kids worshipped it. Pee-wee's Playhouse ran for 5 seasons and earned an impressive number of Emmy Awards. Paul Reubens, although not always known by that name to the public, he rarely broke character in interviews, and even his live appearances were done in full Pee-wee mode. He had created a world so immersive, so distinct, that fans never wanted to leave it. His influence went beyond just comedy. Reubens helped usher in a new kind of children's television that was bold, weird, and unapologetically creative. By the late 80s, Pee-wee Herman was everywhere. There were toys, lunchboxes, Halloween costumes, and even comic books. Reubens was at the top of his game and was super successful. Yet behind all the success, there was something else the cameras didn't catch. While the world was laughing, Paul was carrying weight he rarely spoke about. Personal struggles, quiet heartbreaks, and a desperate call for help. For years, the public only saw the gray suit and the red bow tie. But beneath it all was a man who was complicated and often misunderstood. So how did a man who brought so much joy to millions face the darker side of fame and his own private battles? And what really happened behind the scenes of that bright, candy-colored playhouse? The private struggles of Pee-wee Herman. For millions of fans around the world, Pee-wee Herman was the very definition of joy. He was playful, unpredictable, innocent, and full of life. He felt like a character who seemed to exist in his own world, untouched by the worries of adulthood. But behind that bright smile and iconic laugh, Paul Reubens himself was facing personal battles that were far more complex than anything his character could ever hint at. One of the greatest challenges Paul struggled with was the question of identity. He had created a character so distinct and so amazing that it eventually overshadowed the man behind it. Over the years, fans rarely asked about Paul Reubens, they asked about Pee-wee. They wanted the giggle, the voice, and the wide-eyed mischief. And while Reubens was grateful for the love and success the character brought him, he also felt very trapped by it. He once described the experience as feeling like he had to live inside a costume. No matter where he went, people expected him to perform, and there was little room for just being Paul. Fame, in many ways, boxed him into a version of himself that didn't leave space for growth, complexity, or vulnerability. But his private battles didn't stop at the pressures of fame. Paul Reubens also carried a weight that he couldn't talk about publicly for most of his career, because he was a man living in a time when being open about one's romantic choices came with real risks, especially in Hollywood. In interviews, he carefully sidestepped questions about his personal life, keeping his romantic history and love life firmly behind a curtain. But the truth was far more personal and painful than many knew. In the later years of his life, particularly in an unfinished documentary he had been working on, Reubens opened up about his struggles with identity and acceptance. He revealed that he had experienced deep and meaningful love, including a long-term relationship with another man. But during the height of his fame, when Pee-wee Herman was everywhere, he felt pressure to hide that part of himself because he feared the impact that honesty might have on his career and the character he had worked so hard to build. Back then, the entertainment industry was still very much shaped by rigid expectations. Male actors, especially those with a significant base, were often told, directly or indirectly, that certain truths were better kept private. For Reubens, that meant burying part of who he was. The emotional toll of living a life where key aspects of your identity are off limits and never to be acknowledged publicly is something he carried for decades. And with this secrecy came isolation and loneliness. Reubens was known for being intensely private. Despite his fame, he rarely appeared in the tabloids for parties or public romances. When he wasn't filming or performing, he retreated from the spotlight, spending much of his time alone or with a very small circle of friends. Insiders who knew him described him as kind, thoughtful, and endlessly creative, but also deeply withdrawn. Behind the scenes, he battled loneliness and anxiety, feelings that became more intense after his peak fame years. As the buzz around Pee Wee Herman started to fade and newer faces filled the comedy landscape, Reubens found himself in unfamiliar territory. The world had changed, and the pedestal he'd once stood on no longer felt secure, and he wasn't sure how or if he fit into the industry anymore. However, he never stopped creating. He continued writing, sketching, and dreaming up new projects. But it was different. Without the constant attention of cameras and the pressure to perform, Reubens had more space to reflect, but with that reflection came pain. He had given everything to Pee Wee Herman, and in return, he had built a legacy that would outlive him. But it also came at a cost. He missed out on the kind of emotional openness and public freedom that so many people take for granted. He struggled to feel fully seen, not as Pee Wee, but as Paul. He wanted to be remembered not just for the character he created, but for the human being behind it. However, as his career progressed, Paul found himself entangled in some extremely serious controversies and scandals that would follow him for the rest of his life and cast a shadow over his reputation and legacy. The controversies that shook his career. Paul Reubens had built a world that children adored and adults quietly admired, but in 1991, that colorful world came crashing down in an instant. In July of that year, Reubens was arrested in Sarasota, Florida for indecent exposure at an adult movie theater. The news was jarring, not just because of the arrest itself, but because of who had been arrested. At that time, Pee Wee Herman wasn't just a character, he was seen as a symbol of childhood joy and innocence. So when the headline hit, the public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Almost overnight, toy companies pulled Pee Wee merchandise off store shelves. Networks stopped airing reruns, projects were canceled. And just like that, Paul Reubens, a man who had spent years perfecting his craft and who had inspired countless kids with his weird and wonderful alter ego, found himself in exile. What made the backlash even harder to swallow was the context. Reubens had been arrested at a legal adult theater. He hadn't committed a violent crime or hurt anyone, but the public wasn't interested in the details. The outrage machine had been set in motion, and it was hungry for headlines. The Pee Wee Herman character, once cherished for his quirky innocence, was now being used as a weapon against its creator. Reubens didn't fight back publicly, issue a dramatic statement, or try to shift blame. Instead, he did something few celebrities in crisis have the courage to do. He disappeared. He stepped away from the spotlight, letting the media frenzy die down on its own. But the silence didn't mean he was unaffected. The emotional toll of that moment and the feeling of being rejected by an industry and audience he had given everything to was something he carried with him for the rest of his life. And just when it seemed like things were finally beginning to stabilize, another storm hit. In 2002, Reubens faced new legal trouble. Authorities raided his home as part of an unrelated investigation and claimed to find images and material that they labeled inappropriate and concerning. But this time, Reubens was adamant. He insisted that he was innocent from the start, stating that the material in question was part of a vintage collection that was decades old and not illegal under existing statutes. The case was messy. It was filled with vague accusations and headlines that didn't always match the facts. Ultimately, Reubens was not charged with possession of anything criminal. However, he agreed to a plea deal for a misdemeanor obscenity charge, not because he was guilty of the more serious claims, but because fighting it any further would have dragged the situation out for years and further destroyed his already fragile public image. Still, the damage was done. Again, his name was smeared across newspapers and television screens. Pee Wee Herman was dragged into headlines about scandal, and Paul Reubens was left to pick up the pieces. But something changed this time. Unlike the public scorn he faced in 1991, the reaction from Hollywood in 2002 was very different. Many actors, writers, and directors in the industry rallied around him. People who had worked with Reubens knew the man behind the character. They saw the arrests and allegations not as reflections of who he truly was, but as a public shaming gone too far. They argued that his refusal to play by Hollywood's traditional rules had made him an easy target. One of his most outspoken defenders was director Tim Burton, who had worked with Reubens on Pee-wee's Big Adventure. Others in the comedy world spoke out too, reminding the public of Reubens' enormous contributions to entertainment, his generosity, and his kindness off-screen. For the first time, the narrative began to shift. Thankfully, the public slowly started to see Reubens in a more compassionate light, as someone who had been brutally misunderstood. After years of silence and staying in the shadows, Reubens finally made his way back into the limelight. He returned to acting in the mid-2000s with small but memorable roles in television and film. He played eccentrics, villains, and oddball side characters, all with the same sharp comedic timing that had made Pee-wee famous. And each performance felt like a quiet reminder that he hadn't lost his spark yet. If anything, the hardships had made his art sharper and more poignant. Gradually, public sentiment shifted again. People began to realize that Paul Reubens was more than the controversies that once defined him. He was a gifted artist, a misunderstood outsider, and a man who had endured more than most could imagine, yet still found the strength to make people laugh. He never tried to erase his past. He didn't pretend those dark chapters didn't happen. But he also didn't let them define his story. Instead, he let the work speak for itself. And that, perhaps, is what ultimately allowed him to rebuild his legacy. But even as he re-emerged into the public eye with grace, there was one battle he kept hidden from almost everyone, and it was a quiet struggle that would come to define his final chapter. The health struggles he never spoke about. While the world saw Paul Reubens as the eternally youthful, quirky, and energetic Pee-wee Herman, behind the scenes he was waging the most serious and private battle of his life that almost no one knew was happening. For 6 years, Reubens silently fought 2 aggressive forms of cancer, acute myelogenous leukemia and metastatic lung cancer. These are not easy diagnoses by any measure. Acute myelogenous leukemia is a fast-moving blood cancer that attacks the bone marrow and blood cells, while metastatic lung cancer indicates that the disease has spread beyond its original site. Either one is devastating on its own, and together they present a brutal challenge. But Paul Reubens made a decision early on that spoke volumes about the kind of person he was. He chose to keep his illness private. There were no tabloid leaks, no interviews hinting at medical struggles, and no statements released to prepare the public for a possible goodbye. To those who saw him or worked with him during those years, he was still sharp, creative, and passionate about his projects, and still carried that spark that had made him famous decades before. That kind of quiet courage is rare in the entertainment world. In an age where every moment of struggle is often turned into content, Reubens opted for dignity. He continued working where he could, writing scripts, brainstorming Pee-wee-related ideas, and staying connected to the creative energy that had always sustained him. Even as the treatments took their toll and fatigue crept in, he never allowed his illness to define him. Sadly, Paul Reubens passed away on July 30, 2023, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, at the age of 70. The news came as a shock to many, not just because of the loss itself, but because no one even knew he had been sick. A statement released posthumously on his official Instagram account included a note he had written before his death that read, "Please accept my apology for not going public with what I've been facing the last 6 years. I always felt a huge amount of love and respect from my friends, fans, and supporters. I have loved you all so much and enjoyed making art for you." That statement was heartfelt, sincere, and tinged with that gentle humility that had always made Paul Reubens seem just a little bit different from the Hollywood crowd. In just a few sentences, he acknowledged his fans, explained his silence, and left behind a final message that was both heartbreaking and deeply generous. Emotional reactions from fans, colleagues, and friends poured in immediately. Tim Burton, who had worked directly with him, shared a tribute calling Reubens a great artist and a great friend. Conan O'Brien, Jimmy Kimmel, Natasha Lyonne, and countless other actors and comedians credited Reubens for inspiring them to embrace their own weirdness, quirks, and voice. Fans, too, flooded social media with memories. Some posted clips from Pee-wee's Playhouse or Pee-wee's Big Adventure, while others shared childhood photos holding Pee-wee dolls, remembering how the character had made them laugh when they needed it most. But beneath the sadness, there was also a sense of awe in the fact that Paul Reubens had kept working and smiling through a 6-year battle with a disease that would have broken most people. He had continued to make people laugh while facing something unimaginably difficult, and he never once asked for pity. And that was who Paul Reubens truly was. He was a performer and comedian, but above all, he was a deeply private man who gave the world everything he had, even when it cost him personally. But even in death, there were layers of Paul's story that the public did not quite understand, because although he had suffered from 2 different cancers for several years, there was something in his official cause of death report that left everyone heartbroken. Pee-wee's cause of death revealed. In the days following Paul Reubens' passing, there was an outpouring of love, sorrow, and nostalgia. But with it came an inevitable question. What exactly had taken his life? Well, the answer, when it was officially released, only deepened the heartbreak for most people. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner confirmed that Reubens died from acute hypoxic respiratory failure, a serious condition where the lungs are no longer able to supply enough oxygen to the bloodstream. This kind of respiratory failure is not a disease in itself, but rather the final stage of various underlying illnesses, and in Reubens' case, acute myelogenous leukemia and metastatic lung cancer. The cancers had slowly and aggressively attacked his body, and in his final days, his lungs simply could no longer keep up. It's a sobering diagnosis. Hypoxic respiratory failure is the body's last stand, when oxygen levels drop too low to sustain vital organs. It means breathlessness, fatigue, and, in the final moments, quiet surrender. For someone who lived as lively and inventive as Reubens to be brought down by such a slow illness made the loss feel all the more cruel. But the question that continues to linger is why Paul Reubens kept his illness a secret. Some people believe it was simply his quiet and private personality, trying to be fiercely protective of the line between his on-screen persona and his real life. Others say it was his old-school approach to fame. He didn't want to be known for being sick. He didn't want people to pity him or for his final years to be overshadowed by sympathy and sorrow. There's also the theory that Reubens wanted to preserve Pee-wee's larger-than-life character exactly as fans remembered him. Pee-wee Herman wasn't supposed to age. He wasn't supposed to grow tired, and he wasn't supposed to fade. So, by hiding his illness, Reubens allowed Pee-wee to live bright-eyed, mischievous, and bursting with energy in the collective imagination exactly as he had always been. It was a decision that made his death feel like a sudden jolt, and a light switched off without warning. But it was also one final act of a private man who had always chosen creativity and control over public confession. But before he left us, Paul Reubens did something unexpected. He opened up like never before, allowing cameras to document the sides of himself that few had ever seen, and what he shared was raw, honest, and surprisingly shocking. Pee-wee's final message to the world. For decades, Paul Reubens existed behind a carefully constructed wall. He was part showman and part mystery, but before his death, he made one last decision that broke down that wall for good. His posthumously released documentary, Pee-wee as Himself, is unlike anything fans or critics expected. It is a deeply personal, stripped-back portrait of a man who spent much of his life hiding behind a character, and who, in his final chapter, chose to step forward as himself. The documentary compiles over 40 hours of interviews that Reubens recorded in the years leading up to his death. It is the most unfiltered look into his world ever made public. There's no flashy editing, no dramatic recreations, just Paul Reubens, speaking honestly about his career, his private battles, and his most vulnerable truths. One of the most moving aspects of the film is how candid he was about his identity. For so long, Reubens kept his romantic life and choices private, not out of shame, but out of fear of what the entertainment industry might do with that information, how it might affect the Pee-wee brand, and whether it would be used to reduce him to a headline. In the documentary, he spoke openly about having had a meaningful, long-term relationship with a man, which he cherished, despite the fact that it had to be kept behind closed doors. He also spoke about the emotional toll of being tied so tightly to Pee-wee Herman. While the character gave him fame, purpose, and an entire generation of adoring fans, it also left him feeling trapped at times. He explained that it was so difficult to separate Paul from Pee-wee, not just for the public, but for himself too. The line between who he was and who he was pretending to be had blurred, and it left him feeling confused and lonely. He also directly addressed the major controversies that shaped his career, particularly his 1991 arrest for indecent exposure in a Florida theater. Reubens reflected on the intense public backlash and media frenzy that followed him, and he acknowledged the humiliation and impact it had on his professional life. He also discussed his 2002 arrest and how the public scrutiny and backlash became even worse. However, he made it clear that the incident was misunderstood. He also spoke about how it felt to be mislabeled and mistreated by the public for so long for something he wasn't. And of course, Reubens finally addressed the health struggles he had hidden for years. With remarkable composure and humility, he spoke about living with cancer, about undergoing treatments while continuing to work, and about the emotional fatigue of carrying such a massive burden in silence. Pee-wee as himself is not just a documentary. It's a final gift and a way for Paul Reubens to tell his own story in his own voice after a lifetime of being misunderstood, scrutinized, or overlooked outside of the persona he created. It's a reminder that behind the wild laugh, the red bow tie, and the manic energy, there was a real person who struggled, loved deeply, and made peace with his past. Do you think Paul Reubens deserved the way he was treated by the world? Tell us in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen like this video and subscribe to our channel for more updates.